The Philippine military has been prominent in Philippine politics. Many scholars have noted that this imbalance in Philippine civil-military relations is an indicator of the country's democratic backsliding that has perhaps reached new heights under the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. How did this civil-military dynamics come about? What are its historical roots? And what is the ideal role of the military in a democracy? Because politicians with a military background,
Retired military generals in cabinet positions?
A politicized military?
Hindi
hindi
na
na
bago
bago yan. Hi, I am Lican Delaria,
I am Vekal Porha.
I am Aaron Malyari.
and this is Podcast, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Isa na namang interesanting topic ang pag-uusapan natin today. Politics and the military. Parang sanay na tayo na makita ang mga graduates ng Philippine Military Academy or ng PMA na after their retirement, lumilipat bakod para maging senador, may naging presidente pa nga, o di kaya ma-appoint sa iba't ibang mga cabinet positions na siguro akala natin normal lang ito, ano?
Pero hindi ito ideal. Ayan, simula pa lang tinapos ko na yung episode na to. Sinasabi natin na hindi ideal yung maraming mga military men taking over government positions or being in elective positions. Maraming dalang problema kasi talaga yung politicized military or when the military sees politics as an alternative career.
Pero bakit? So to answer this, we talked to Dr. Aries Arugay, Professor of Political Science from the Department of Political Science of the University of the Philippines Diliman, to help enlighten us regarding this topic. Unang tanong natin sa kanya, in a democracy, what is the role of the military?
Ang isang sabihin na natin militar, minsan sa ating lengguwahe ang tawag sandatahang lakas, no, armed forces. Ang role niya sa isang demokrasya ay ang pagpapatibay ng mga prinsipyo, norms at institutions nito. At ang key na prinsipyo ng isang demokrasya ay popular sovereignty, na yung soberanya ay nasa tao at ang may kapangyarihan ay ang mga hinahalal ng mga sibilyan. At pag sinabi nating sibilyan, hindi ito formal na parte ng military. Kaya merong sa ating constitution that civilian authority is always supreme over the military. Tinatawag natin civilian supremacy. And therefore, sa isang demokrasya or even in any modern state, the military is subservient to civilian political authority. Kaya ang isang trabaho ng isang pangulo o ang isang head of state ay commander-in-chief of the armed forces because ultimate authority over the military should not be given to the uniform. Kasi pag ganon, that means the military is already ruling rather than being the coercive or violent arm of the state. At alam natin sa Politics 101 that ito yung esensya ng isang estado, di ba? The monopoly of the legitimate instruments of violence. Yung main instrument nun, yung militar. So, very critical yung role niya, lalo na sa pagpapatibay ng integridad ng Estado laban sa mga kaaway na panlabas. So doon makikita natin na in any democracy, the military ideally is in charge of national security. Ito ay ang pagpapatibay o pagdedepensa ng interes ng isang bansa, lalo na sa mga threats o sa mga maaring maging mga kaaway ng bansa na panlabas externally. Ngunit, alam natin, while ito yung ideal, napakaraming demokrasya na mga bago at maraming mga bansa sa mundo, yung mga tinatawag natin na post-colonial states, na hindi ito yung trabahong ibinibigay sa military.
Maganda yung paliwanag ni Aris tungkol sa ano dapat ang papel ng military. Una, national security. At kadalasan, yung panlabas. directed towards outsiders or foreign powers. Ikalawa, they are subservient to civilian authority. Kaya nga kung nagkataka ang ilan sa ating mga listeners, bakit ang president ng commander-in-chief of the military? This is because the president represents the highest civil authority. So this tells the military na, hoy, yung ibinoto at ipinili naming presidente, ang head nyo. So ibig sabihin, there is civilian supremacy. And the president need not wear some ill-fitting military fatigue to send that message.
Kaya nga 'di ba, civil, nauuna yung civil sa civil-military relations. Kasi may primacy yung civilian authority. Nabanggit din ni Aries na the military wields the state's legitimate instruments of violence. This much power is given to an institution to defend the country. Imagine if that institution is politicized. It could mean disaster for any democracy.
Kaya naman we need not look far for an example of how bad it can get for some countries when the military plays a more hegemonic role in the state. Nariyan ang Myanmar, ang Thailand, mga kapitbahay natin. Sa mga post-colonial states, sabi nga ni Aris, iba yung papel ng military. Ang Pilipinas, post-colonial state din naman. Pero bakit iba ang military natin sa mga kapitbahay natin? Aries explains in this snippet from our interview.
Kung titingnan natin, yung kasaysayan ng ating military, kaiba sa mga kapitbahay natin. The Armed Forces of the Philippines, while it traces its origins with the Katipunan, officially, the Philippine Army, which is the first manifestation of the Philippine military, was created by Commonwealth Act No. 1, and by virtue of this, is therefore a colonial army. Meaning, it was established by American colonial power. But we all know formally, because the Katipunan wasn't a successful revolution, unlike Indonesia, for example, the Indonesian military traces its origins from the Dutch colonial struggle, and they won. And because of that, the Indonesian military is a liberation army. Tayo kasi colonial, meaning it was imposed, it was created by the Americans. At dahil colonial army siya, it had no say on its role. In fact, its first mandates or missions, kasi military may mga mission, was against the hooks, was against domestic enemies, because the Americans were building military installations in the Philippines. The biggest outside of the mainland, US, Subic and Clark, would eventually become the biggest military installations when we were granted independence outside of US territory. At dahil doon, parang nagkaroon ng external defense shield ang Pilipinas. So parang sabi ng mga Americans, huwag nyo na problemahin yung external defense. Sagot na namin yan. Kaya lang, marami kayong kaaway sa loob. Kaaway, quote-unquote. Maraming threats sa Philippine Commonwealth and eventually the Philippine Republic. From the get-go, unfortunately, we did not satisfy the external defense mission normally given to the military, very domestic-oriented, yung ating military. Kaya kung titignan mo, di ba, the hooks became the PKP. Mahaba yung hugot. No? Kaya ka ngayon merong NTFL ka. Kasi the military is still fighting its original enemy that was imposed by American colonial power. So, in other words, if you notice, while in our Constitution, it says that the Armed Forces of the Philippines is the protector of the state and its people. Actually, malaking debate yon, no? Kasi in other countries, hindi nila nilalagay yon because that's an entry point for politicization. Because the military can then determine whether a government is still serving the people. And if it does not, parang sinasabi ng Constitution, part of your duty is to protect the people from oppressive governments, which you cannot find in the constitutions of other modern democracies because the military is a non-deliberative institution, meaning it cannot even get to that point to judge the legitimacy of governments because it should not deliberate. It should merely follow. Ito yung ginagamit na basehan. And if you notice, all the military adventures in politics, kasi sabi ko nga, the Philippines might be the only country wherein the military did not successfully stage a coup, yung military initiated. Kasi the only successful military intervention in political crisis that the military has done was during EDSA 2. EDSA 1 was not. EDSA 1 was a failure, di ba? It was an aborted coup. It's the only country wherein the military is politicized and powerful despite not staging a successful coup ever in its history.
Gusto ko yung pag-historicize ni Aris ng kasaysayan ng Philippine military. Iba yung naging development ng ating military. The fact that it was mandated by the Americans during the US occupation of the country to focus on internal issues, rebellion, itong ang mga hooks, mukhang naging historical arch nemesis na nga ng ating military ang mga insurgents, mga rebels, at later on, mga komunista.
Sabi rin ni Aris, yung phrasing ng role of the military sa ating constitution somehow enables the politicization of this institution. The military can say, well, this government is not serving the people, then we must remove this government. Parang mahirap naman yun, di ba?
Totoo yan, no? Dapat hindi yan trabaho ng military kasi nga, sabi ni Aris, it is not a deliberative institution. Dapat, in theory, sumusunod sila. Interestingly, never pa naman talagang nangyari na primarily through the military nasipa yung isang pamahalaan natin. They play a role, yes, but none of the coups has ever been successful despite the politicization of our military. Perhaps the Philippine military still subscribes to the most basic tenets of their subservience to the state. Let's listen to Aris, how he explains this.
Sa atin, what accounts for this interventionist tendency and this highly politicized military? Babalik ako doon sa roles na binigay sa kanya. Because the more domestic, at comparatively, if you look at other countries, the more domestic ang nature ng military missions, the more politicized it gets. Kasi kung yung military nakikita na ba't ang daming kurakot na politiko? Because, not everyone is attracted to serve in the military. It might sound romanticized, but some people are really driven by values, by love of country, di ba? Patriotism, loyalty, duty. And then they see the civilian politicians who are supreme over them are actually the ones causing the problem. So may individual na ganong dynamic, no, at the level of the individual officers. But institutionally, iniiba natin yun minsan because the military is still a corporate institution. Yung kanilang pagiging politicized has also something to do with the inability of civilian government to professionalize the military. Because some civilian politicians wants a politicized military kasi pwede nilang gawing instrumento in their political agendas. So dito papasok whether yung politician mo is really thinking of the national interest, meaning a military that's professional, that's oriented toward external defense, or a military that is politicized and therefore pwede nyong gamitin as a weapon against your political enemies, as we have seen, in fact, in civilian governments, particularly during martial law and even after martial law.
The more domestic the nature of military missions, the more politicized they get. And these people in the military, they were trained, they were drilled to love the country, be selfless, at iba pang values. So, when they see that something is wrong, they are somehow driven to act.
And these military values like honor, integrity, selflessness, at iba pa, these values are the same ones we'd like our political leaders to have, di ba? Kaya rin siguro itong mga military men, ayan ha, men, kasi the military is also a hyper-masculine institution. Siguro pag-usapan natin yan sa ibang episode. Anyway, military men make for great political candidates kasi nga they have these values. Kumbaga, they can say, nagsilbi na yan sa bayan. So, military people can bank on that and say that they will continue to do so. We have had leaders do precisely that. Ramon Magsaysay was a war hero. Ferdinand Marcos was, he was a fake military hero. But they have used that as a launch pad for their political careers.
Yung inversion naman yan ay yung mga non-military politicians seeing the potential of the military for their political agenda. Ito naman yung isang side ng politicization ng military when it is induced by self-serving politicians for their interest. So when did it start? For Aries, it starts with martial law.
Over time, nakita yung martial law kasi very institutionalized participation ng military. In fact, Marcos called the military a partner in national development. So, in terms of martial law, you only have a civilian, quote-unquote, head, but actually the regime itself was highly militarized. Fast forward tayo post-martial law. So ano yung nangyari? What basically happened across these administrations was that there was really a lack of attention to professionalizing the military. Meron kasing teorya sa civil-military relations, the more the military is modernized, it's highly capable. The more that it's focused on its external mission, the less politicized it becomes. Unfortunately, post-martial law, the Philippines is one of the most underfunded militaries in Asia. Dito papasok that we were not, and I know some people might give us a hard time, give me a hard time by saying na, teka, ang ibig mo sabihin, dapat pinupondohan natin yung military. Isn't that anathema to democracy? Let's give them toys so that they won't meddle in politics. But you are giving the military the means to really perform its ideal mission. Sa akin, unless we're really secured about our national interest, calling for the abolition of the military is a big no-no for me because I would want a military that's more externally focused, that's really guarding the territorial integrity of the republic. Kaya lang hindi nga ganun eh.
So post-martial law, the military was not professionalized. It was underfunded. It cannot perform what it was ideally meant to do. So, maaari rin sigurong nagkaroon ng discontent with the military. I mean, sa dami ng kudeta nung panahon ni Cory, hindi malayong, yun ay dahil hindi sila masaya sa sitwasyon. Yung pag-regain ng civilian supremacy.
Perhaps this could also be due to the limits set by the Constitution for military spending. Kasi diba, the 1987 Constitution actually prohibits allocating more funds to the military compared to education. Which is good naman. But our education budget has always been lower than the ideal standard. So, kung mas mababa pa for the military, baka nga naman may source of discontent, diba? Tapos, nakikita nila ang corruption in the civil government. So, this could be a rationale for them to seek for reform through other means. Not overthrowing the government per se, but looking toward changing the situation through the executive or legislative branches of government.
And through the executive, we have seen how retired generals have occupied cabinet positions. Let's listen to Aries explain this phenomenon.
Ang nakikita natin is that yung phenomenon ng retired generals during the time of Duterte, yun yung peak. Because other administrations before, meron naman pero manaka-naka. For example, to my count, there has only been 4 secretaries of national defense since 1986, 1987, after martial law, that has no military background. Orly Mercado, Nonong Cruz. I won't count Gloria Arroyo because she served concurrently as president and DND secretary, Bert Gonzales, and Gibo Chodoro. They had no military background, meaning they did not go to PMA, they did not get any ranks from the police or the military. But the rest are all retired generals, retired chief of staff. And during the time of Duterte, this spilled over a lot of cabinet portfolios that normally you would not give to the military. Saan ka nakakita DSWD secretary, military? Saan nakakita peace process? Saan ka nakakita environment? And ang sabi ko nga, may multiplier effect yan. When you appoint a retired general to head a cabinet agency, he brings forth his PMA batch or everyone who worked under him when he was still a military commander. So may multiplier effect. Malaking debate yan. Some people believe na pag-retired civilian na. Kasi hindi na naka-uniform. But the counter to that is in countries wherein formal institutions and formal norms on governance are not yet established, may blurring of boundaries between the formal and informal. What is the implication on the civilian bureaucracy? From what I gather, lalo na during the Duterte administration, it really regresses the development of our bureaucracy. Kasi papalitan naman pala sila ng ex-military and it somehow gives the military a signal that they all have second careers. Pero bakit nagiging employment agency sila ng gobyerno? Why can't they just enjoy their retirement? One trade-off of appointing all these military generals is that they don't appreciate the plurality of views necessary for policy making. Kasi they're always on crisis mode. Quick fixes na kahit hindi pinag-iisipan yung repercussions and ramifications. And then we've seen this in the Philippine pandemic response. Not every policy challenge, policy issue is a crisis. And we've seen that it requires a lot of thinking from multiple perspectives. So yung diversity of views in a cabinet, yung diversity of views necessary for effective policy making, nawawala yon. And the military is a non-deliberative institution. And I think we need to emphasize that the benefits of appointing ex-military officials should be balanced with the possible limitations. They're not really trained to lead.
Striking sa akin yung point ni Aris about cabinet positions becoming a second career. But is there anything wrong with this? Nabanggit ni Aris yung regression sa ating bureaucracy, pati yung very nature ng pagiging isang ex-military person.
Siyempre, dala nila yung military working style nila, no?
And the military mind, as Aris said, kung iisipin mo nga naman, sa military, walang discussion. It's about following orders.
True, they are not really trained to lead, they are trained to follow. And is there really a place for a military mind, say, in the DENR? Former DENR Secretary si Matu was an ex-military. And you know what he did about the Manila Bay cleanup? He fashioned it into a battle. The battle for Manila Bay ang tawag niya. In honor of the many battles fought daw in the Manila Bay. And this is so funny. Just recently, the DNR with the DND unveiled plans to build a battle cannon replica in the Manila Bay. Imagine an environmental protection agency building a cannon replica. That's what the military mind does to an agency that, quite frankly, does not need it.
Tama yung sabi ni Aris. It's always crisis thinking, crisis response, and not every problem requires this kind of thinking. Kailangan syempre ng multiple perspectives.
The military is a non-deliberative institution nga. Kaya nga siguro Duterte pandered to the military kasi he wants yes men. No, yung tinatawag na yes men. People who will just follow orders. Anong repercussions nito sa current state of the Philippine military and the elections? This is what Aris has to say.
Duterte's administration has put a lot of the military's agenda front and center against terrorists, against communists, and even civil society organizations who are perceived to be aiding insurgents. Nadamay na, no? And the promise is that they will end the communist insurgency by the time the Duterte administration steps down. And this is not happening. What does this mean? That again, the mission is unfinished. But the military saw, because Duterte is the first president to really unconditionally side with the military on these issues. So the military will make sure, or at least will want, a similar president because this mission is unfinished. You're talking about the only military in Southeast Asia who has never been victorious in a war that it has waged in its history. It wasn't victorious against the Spanish, against the Americans, against the Japanese. Although tinulungan nila, of course, yung USAF, no? But across post-independence, we have the longest running Maoist-inspired insurgency in the world, if not in Asia. Unlike in other countries like our neighbors, either they became governments or they were vanquished. The Philippine military is still fighting this long, protracted war. And this is why they wanted a government that will have the same disposition as the Duterte administration. So makikita natin that they might support, or some of them have already formally endorsed or supported. Some of them are retired, of course, but we all know the retired active division is more a formal line than an actual division, no, within the military. Some of them have already expressed preference for Marcos Jr. because Marcos Jr. has categorically said that he will continue yung NTF-ELCAC, he will continue the fight against violent extremists, against terror. So basically copying Duterte's security agenda. The war on drugs will still continue, etc. So they see that Marcos Jr. represents. And they see that he is, since he is leading at least the surveys, that he has the best chance. Even if you have, supposedly, another military trained candidate, no? Panfilo Lacson.
Medyo nakaka-bother itong president na sinet ni Duterte, ano? And I agree with Aris. The military might be inclined to support someone who will continue Duterte's policies and stances regarding, for example, sa communist insurgency. And alam naman natin na it's Marcos Jr. who is positioning himself as the Duterte successor, at least sa level ng policy agenda.
And this just goes to show that the upcoming election is an important exercise for us voters to set things right, to put the military in its rightful position. I mean, we are already aware of what the Philippine military can do, how it has historically positioned itself, how it has considered its natural enemies, the communists, sabi ni Aries. We already know what the military's trigger points are. But the upcoming elections is not particularly reassuring. This is what he had to say about this.
What I fear is that in these upcoming elections, some elements have already red tagged some candidates, has already linked some candidates with the communist movement, even if the Duterte administration Secretary of Justice has already expressed an opinion that there's nothing wrong with it. But regardless of that, there's such a McCarthyan anti-communist sentiment right now in Philippine politics that it is disturbing. It has shaped the minds through disinformation, that anything to do with the communist and even the broader term left is an enemy of the state. So this is something that is quite scary because it's a slippery slope. And therefore, as voters, I think we should cast our vote informed in a way that will not allow such thinking to continue. That will somehow make sure to remind the military that it must be subservient to civilian authority and not the other way around. But to also be very vigilant against civilian politicians who would invite the military into politics. And this is across, because I observe that it's not simply monopolized by one candidate. It seems like a lot of Filipino politicians have become so accustomed because it's normalized. For example, pag security matters, military lang yung kinokonsult. But national security is not a default military area because national security is civilian in nature. Hindi rin dapat tayo magpadala na pag military sila lang ang may alam sa national security, sa security policy. Hindi yun, no? But that also means that we must groom, train, educate, and equip civilian experts in national defense because if there's a critical core of those, then the military's monopoly could be challenged. And if you ask some of the military officials, they submit to civilian experts in national security and defense. Kasi sila din, alam nila at the strategic and tactical level lang or operational level. But strategic-wise, policy-wise, the military is not involved in those processes. It's civilians who craft that. So hopefully, the elections will produce a government that is wary of the repercussions of having the military dominate policy making. They could serve as inputs. They could be consulted, but at the end, civilians must make security policy. Because if not, then we're just simply empowering the military who's already empowered in a way.
May danger talaga na ginagamit itong anti-communist narrative, itong red tagging, anti-left tendency ng Duterte administration. And I agree, this coming elections, it's our chance talaga to set things right. Sabi nga ni Vic, to put the military in their rightful place. Kasi as Aries said, national security and security policy are not the monopoly of the military.
And we have people in the academe like Aries and other scholars who do not come from a military background but are adept in analyzing security issues. Kailangan balansehin natin yung conversation. The government does not need people who will just say yes to whatever the political elite says. It needs people who will enable an environment that is conducive to discussions and argumentations to better improve the nation.
And for sure, we need the perspectives of all peoples from different walks of life. Lahat tayo may maibabahagi sa pagpapaunlad ng bansa.
Alright, we would like to thank Professor Aries Arugay for joining us in this conversation. Marami pang insights si Aries, so if you are interested in listening to our full interview with him, it's exclusively available sa aming website, podcast.org.
And if you want more of podcasts and to continue the conversation na rin, like, follow at subscribe na sa aming Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, where we just recently reached 1,000 likes.
At magkapatuloy ang hindi na bago yan next week. So abangan nyo yan. For now, stay safe and have a good day.